What was your scariest moment? Part 2. Story 1. My boyfriend and I were in Japan. We had decided to climb Mount Fuji, and it took us most of the day to get there, which we weren't expecting. Our plan was to climb all the way from the bottom, along the oldest track there, the Yoshitaguchi Trail, to the top. This trail has 10 stations along it, which are mountain huts. In the open season, they're supposed to have food, water, and accommodation at them. We climbed in the off-season, and we're planning on staying at the 5th station, halfway, overnight, and climbing the rest of the way in the morning. So it's hot and humid. We arrived at the bottom of the mountains at around 3 to 4 p.m. Our last meals and drinks were at 11 a.m. We're both carrying backpacks. We're both wearing Chuck Taylors. Great climbing shoes, right? We started walking under the impression that about an hour in there would be this noodle house open, where we could get food and water. We arrived at the noodle house. It's closed. Shit. Okay, let's keep going. We can do this, right? It's only supposed to be 2 hours or so. That's fine. The trail is narrow and made of dirt with stones in it. We're walking through forest with long grass around. We see a deer. I freak out after almost stepping on a frog. I thought it was a snake. It starts to get dark. The trail is still a gradual incline. We almost went the wrong way, but think we're on the right trail. There is no one around. We're in this forest. Thankfully, we had torches, but we're feeling pretty thirsty now. We worry about the darkness. It gets dark. We're exhausted and thirsty. We're building up a sweat, but it's really cold. We occasionally come across a shrine. It's eerie in the dark. The trail gets harder. It turns into steep hills with large rocks. At the start of each hill is a pit with stones in it that we either have to edge around or walk across a plank of wood to cross. We start to come along the stations. I don't know about the one season, but these buildings we found had fallen apart. There was rubble everywhere. This freaks us out. Imagine coming across this ancient Japanese building in the dark. It looked haunted. We start to think we're on the wrong trail. No one must come here anymore. Oh shoot, we're so isolated. No one is around. What happens if we don't get to the 5th station? We trudge on. A storm starts to roll in. It is pitch black around us. I turned my torch on and off to see how dark it was. Why did I do that? It was terrifying. We start to become extremely fatigued. We were collapsing every 100 meters or so. We'd have to stop and sit on our packs. No water. We took turns freaking out. I'd start crying while my boyfriend tried to comfort me. When I recovered, he'd break down and I'd have to comfort him. We hear some music coming through the forest, which sounds like it's coming from the road we know runs up to the 5th station. We're too scared to leave the trail, so we call for help. No one answers. We've passed the 4th station, and we know it can't be much further. We came upon another building. WTF, this is the 5th station? I can read limited Japanese, and I can see the number 5 written on a sign. The building was dilapidated. It was locked. It was dark. No one was around. We knocked on the door just in case. No one. Shit. The storm was getting louder. We're absolutely desperate and despairing. We decide to continue on, and if we don't find anything else, we'll come back here and sleep out in the open in our sleeping bags. We found another sign. Again, I can only read the numbers, and it has a map of the trail. I see where we are, but it also showed another road that trailed off to the right with nothing. Number 5 on it. This gives us hope that this is a false 5th station. Collapsing, thirsty, exhausted, we struggle our way on. We get a few meters and collapse over and over again. My boyfriend wants to turn back and sleep on the ground near the last hut. It was the only flat area around. I keep reminding him of the sign and its promise of another station. We round a corner and the trail disappears through some bushes. We climb out through it onto a sealed road. We're so effing relieved, and we see lights on a building just above us. Our trail cuts across the road, but we say F it and follow the road instead. We found some stairs that lead up to a building. We collapse there meters from the building. Struggle upwards again. We find a toilet block next to some building that doesn't look like anyone's around it. Desperate, we drink water from the sink of the toilet block. We found out the next day that this isn't safe drinking water. You have to buy bottled water on Mount Fuji. We continue onwards and find another building, and we see a girl inside. She comes out when she sees us, and in our extremely limited Japanese, my boyfriend asks her if we can sleep here. She says yes. We scramble inside, dump everything on the floor, and ask for food and water. I was craving sugar, and I was shaking at this point. The first thing I had was a can of Coke and a Snickers bar. It was the best thing I'd ever had in my life. I gulped it down quicker than I've ever eaten before. We then had dinner served to us, and they gave us extra food. Out of pity, I think, we looked absolutely horrific. We collapsed in the bedding provided. The next morning, we were still too exhausted to climb to the summit. So we walked around to where the buses arrived, which is what I saw on the sign at the Falls 5th station, and had a long, cranky trip to Tokyo. Worst experience ever, as well as the most terrifying I can think of. Sorry if that was long. I have to say, climbing Mount Fuji in Chuck Taylors and with limited supplies seems like a bold move, but hey, you live and you learn, right? I gotta give you props for powering through the exhaustion and dehydration, even in the pitch black darkness. And finding a toilet block with running water, that's some resourceful thinking right there. All in all, I think this experience will definitely be one for the books. You look back on it and laugh, hopefully. And who knows, maybe you'll even be inspired to climb more mountains. With proper shoes and supplies, of course. Story 2. About 15 years ago, my family and I were staying at some Bible camp with a bunch of other families we knew. All the adults had gone back to tents, cabins, and the kids snuck out to hang out and have some fun. The driveway and entrance to the place was about half a mile away from a backwoods highway that was not too busy, but was one of the main roads into the nearest town. Anyway, a handful of us kids decided to go hang out by the road and cause some mischief. Then someone got the brilliant idea to play Run to the Line, the double line in the middle of the road. Anyway, we were just messing around, and then we saw an 18-wheeler coming barrel-ass down the road at about 60 to 65. We dared one of the groups to run out in front of the truck, which, being young and stupid, he did. I've never before or since seen an 18-wheeler actually hop. Basically, the guy threw on his air brakes or emergency brakes while going full speed. Took him about a quarter mile to finally come to a full stop, at which point the driver got out and started after us yelling every colorful phrase you can think of. I'm sure whatever he was carrying got wrecked along with his truck's braking system. We all took off and ran back to the camp and snuck back into our respective tents or cabins. Meanwhile, we heard sirens start blaring down the road in the direction of the camp. I can still see the images of the police searchlights shining through my tent as the cops tried to search for people at the camp. The next day, we all met again to see if anything happened or anyone got caught. The camp staff had been called up by the police in the night to question people, but no one that was there had said anything or was ever caught that I know of. To this day, anytime I get near a large truck like that, all I can think of is the sparks that flew out as that truck tried to stop. Well, it looks like we've got a little mischievous group of kids on our hands here. I can't say I'm surprised, though. I mean, what else are you supposed to do when you're stuck at a Bible camp with a bunch of boring adults? Run to the line, of course. In the end, no one got caught, and I'm sure those kids were thanking their lucky stars they got away with it. But let this be a lesson to all of you youngsters out there. Don't mess with the big rigs. They may look slow and lumbering, but they've got some serious stopping power, and a whole lot of colorful language apparently. Be careful. Story 3. Nothing really scares me, but there are a few things that others would probably consider pretty scary. Was in a 15-passenger van being transported to a forestry work site down an extremely muddy logging road in the rain. When the van lost traction on a curve in the road and slid off to the side, van flipped onto its side and was stopped from going down a steep 200-meter or so drop-off by a well-placed tree. Was dropped off into one of the remotest places in my province by a helicopter by myself for 10 hours, where I had to finish some forestry work in an old clear-cut, the whole time being circulated by grizzly bears and the occasional moose. Got caught in a freak storm with hurricane force winds while next to the tree line of a clear-cut. Had to dodge many large falling trees. Just barely made it out of the path of a falling 150-plus foot tree, whose branches scraped the back of my calves as I ran. Got caught between a mama black bear and her baby, who was up a tree right next to me. When I realized what was happening, I was able to get out of the way. Chased a black bear out of a camp armed only with a large hunting knife. Fell backward off a 12-foot cliff and tumbled about 100 feet down a steep mountainside before I was able to stop myself. Honestly, I'm impressed. I mean, who needs horror movies when you've got this guy's life story? Losing traction on a muddy logging road in the middle of the rain and flipping a 15-passenger van onto its side is child's play. This guy was dropped off by a helicopter in the middle of nowhere and had to fend off grizzly bears and moose like it was just another day at the office. And let's not forget that time he got caught in a freak storm with hurricane force winds and had to dodge falling trees like a ninja. In all seriousness, though, this guy must have nerves of steel. I don't think I'd last 5 minutes in his shoes. But hey, at least he's got some killer stories to tell. Maybe he should write a book or something. I know I'd read it. Story 4. Kinda lame in comparison to some of these posts. I'm currently on a regimen of Accutane, very potent acne medicine, my father's back acne genes, which supposedly can cause various psychological issues, though I've never experienced the severe depression that is reported to sometimes cause. I've recently had some interesting and terrifying events on it. I have experienced sleep paralysis while on it 3 times so far. Check wiki. Though I'm not even sure the medicine is what caused it. I've never before experienced it since being on it. I always have the same hallucination. I'm conscious, but unable to move. I hear faint whispering in my ears and try to move, but cannot even writhe from the voices and horror that arises inside me. The whispers elevate to fairly audible speech. Many voices, but in an incoherent language, or even gibberish. The voices turn to screaming, but still impossible to be made out. Finally, static. This pattern repeats itself at least another time. Throughout this, when my terror heightens, I attempt to scream for help, but cannot. Hands down the scariest recurring event that happens to me. Story 5. A few. Being labor, the epidural wearing off, pushing, and amid all the pain, realizing there's no reverse button, blacking out from standing up too fast. I lose control of all of my muscles, which start convulsing. I was told this is a common ailment in the elderly. While I had my hand inside a very heavy birdcage that was situated above my head. I go down, birdcage goes with me. It smashes my head into a window frame. Concussion ensues. I wake up thinking all of my family members are aliens or imposters that have taken over my family members' bodies. And so I start to freak out. By far one of the strangest and scariest moments of my life. I was convinced they were aliens that were trying to rape me, mentally. Anyway, 6 hours, 2 MRIs, an ibuprofen 800, and thousands of dollars in medical bills later. I'm told I'm fine, but not to have any more head trauma anytime soon. Eventually, delusions of aliens dissipate, for the most part. Giving birth is already a pretty intense experience. But adding in a failing epidural and the realization that there's no reverse button, that's enough to make anyone's head spin. Guess the moral of the story is to always be careful around heavy bird cages and to try not to stand up too quickly. But seriously, I hope you're doing okay now and that you don't have to deal with any more head trauma anytime soon. Story 6. I've ridden off a few sport bikes, one of them several times. Had too many close calls to count, gotten a serious concussion, but oddly, the closest I've ever come to literally crapping my pants was getting busted for underage drinking. My parents are wonderful people, but teetotalers, and strictly about it. Still, and I'm 30, and moved out when I was 20. I grew up near a zit on the ass end of nowhere, so me and a friend of mine have just finished a couple of beers and we're driving back into town. There were a couple of cars in the middle of a dirt road intersection. No worries, we'll just drive into the ditch a little and go around them. They're probably doing the same thing as we are. At least that was my train of thought, until I saw the light rack on top of one of the vehicles and then the spotlight came on, and I very nearly soiled myself. Story 7. I was sitting in front of my computer doing pretty much nothing when I heard some noise outside my window. I was sitting right in front of the window facing it. I turned down the music and seconds later, I hear an ear-deafening sound and both my windows were crushed by a 50-centimeter high garden pot. I got covered in glass, was nearly hit by the pot. Outside, I spotted an ex-friend for a second before he walked away. The reason he did it was because an assault occurred at a party I attended. In a police officer interview, another ex-friend had told the police I was involved in the beating. So when they interviewed me the second time, I told them the truth, that he did it, which he didn't like. This was 8 months ago, and I'm still too afraid to go back to the town where it happened and have stopped being with friends. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That must have been really scary, especially since you were right there in front of the window when it happened. It's understandable that you would feel afraid to go back to the town where it happened and be around your old friends. Life is full of unexpected twists and turns, and sometimes the most difficult situations can lead us to new and better things. Story 8. When I was 18, I was traveling in Mexico with a friend. We were on a bus going through the middle of nowhere, and out of nowhere, About 30 guys with huge guns pulled us over, came on the bus, and started yelling at us in Spanish. We didn't speak the language, and frankly, were terrified, being young and on our own. We got off the bus with the other people and stood on the side of the road while they ripped apart all the luggage and held their guns pointed at us. Eventually, they let us go, and we got back on the bus. When we got to our destination, we looked through our bags. Nothing was missing. But then again, we didn't really have anything that they would have wanted. For all I know, they were looking for drugs, guns, or fruit. But it was pretty frightening. Story 9. Getting a call from my husband while I was at work to inform me that my 5-month-old baby had fallen headfirst off a countertop at the babysitter's house with her bouncy chair strapped to her back. It was a 4-foot drop. After a 9-hour trip to the ER, she ended up being A-okay, but my blood still runs icy just thinking about it. Waking up after a bad car accident and having to look into the mirror to determine whether or not I was dead. My murky logic at that time was that if I couldn't see myself when I looked into the mirror, it would mean that I was dead. After gaining the courage, I looked, and well, I'm still here, I think. I can't even imagine how terrifying those experiences must have been for you. The thought of something happening to you or your little one is every parent's worst nightmare. I'm so glad to hear that your baby ended up being okay, but I can only imagine how much stress and anxiety that whole situation must have caused you. Story 10. I was skiing in Colorado. I'd gone off the trail and was skiing in a river valley. It was overcast and the light was extremely flat. I'd gotten considerably ahead of my group, so I stopped to wait. While I stood there, I took off my goggles to clean out some snow. That's when I noticed 3 feet in front of me was a cliff. It was a straight 100-foot drop onto exposed rock. Because of the flat light and lack of depth, it looked like the trail continued down the valley. 3 lucky feet. I had to hike back up the trail and out. I still get a sick feeling thinking about it. Story 11. Passing, rather preoccupied in thoughts, a pelican crossing. I am pretty sure my light was green, and realizing after a few more meters that a Mercedes, which must have traveled at around 60 kilometers an hour, had missed me by at best 20 centimeters. The driver made an all-out braking, but oddly enough, I did not care. Kept walking and thought, well, that would have been over quick. I still don't find it really scary though, but if I put myself in another person's perspective, which I think I will take on later in my life, I would choose that moment. You must have nerves of steel to keep on walking after a near miss with a speeding car. It's interesting how our minds work in moments like these. Sometimes we react with fear and panic, while other times we just shrug it off and keep going like it's no big deal. It sounds like you were in the later camp with this particular moment. Story 12. When I was 8, I woke up to something warm on the back of my head at 3 in the morning. I saw a silhouette of someone standing next to me, arm reaching out to my pillow. Someone was cradling my head. I screamed, loud. My mom burst through the door within 3 to 4 seconds of my blood-curdling scream, and I told her what had happened. But the silhouette had vaporized. I swear to this day that what I felt and saw was real, but at the same time, there's no possible physical explanation for someone disappearing. Story 13. A few years ago, a kid invited me and my pal to a birthday party in the garden of their new house. We went into the house to take a look and entered a small room under the stairs, when suddenly the door closed and the handle slipped out onto the other side, locking us in the dark 6-square-meter room. I was so frightened. Luckily, the kid's younger brother pulled the handle back in and we were safe. Story 14. Seeing a kid fall out of a 5th-story window. He survived. 25 years later, I still hate seeing people hanging out windows and sitting on balcony edges. Also, the first 2 nights of my 7 days in a stint in Bangkok jail were quite scary. Story 15. When I was about 10 or 11, I was hiking with a group of people when someone stepped on a hornet's nest. I ended up getting stung over 100 times, and literally hundreds of bear encounters. Story 16. Climbing the cables on Half Dome comes to mind. They tell you it's steep. What they don't tell you that the granite you must climb is worn slick by years of people hiking to the top. Story 17. When I was a kid, around 10, my dad took me on a spearfishing dive. We caught the attention of a requiem shark, probably a bull. I've never moved faster in my life. Story 18. I almost got cut in half by an industrial machine. Somebody saved me. I had already given up trying to escape in the few seconds I had to think. Story 19. When I was a kid in India this summer working at a school, some crazy man came in and pulled out a knife on me in front of all the kids. Story 20. I was bitten by a rattlesnake while hiking. I passed out eventually and woke up at the hospital. I was convinced I was gonna die. Story 21. tripping on salvia, I thought the last 10 years of my life were a dream, and I had to live them over again. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.